The HOA queen called 911 to evict me. She had no idea I owned her house. Get off this property right now, or I swear to God I will have you arrested. The woman's voice cut across the still morning air like a blade. Her face flushed crimson as she jabbed a finger inches from my face. I hadn't even set my coffee down yet. Behind her, two sheriff's deputies stood at the edge of the dock, hands on their belts, watching me with uncertain eyes. She had actually done it, called 911 on the owner of this cabin before I'd been here 10 minutes. The lake shimmered peacefully behind us, indifferent. I looked at her manicured nails, her HOA lanyard swinging against her chest, the absolute certainty carved into every line of her face, and I thought, she has no idea. She genuinely has no idea who she's talking to. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. My name is Marichin. I'm 41, a structural engineer, and I grew up in Spokane in a house where we didn't waste words or money. I've spent 20 years building a career that was quiet, methodical, and, if I'm honest, invisible to people like the woman now screaming at me. I bought the Lakehouse at Cedar Pines 3 years ago as an investment property. It's a 1,940 square foot log cabin on half an acre with private dock access on Lake Harrow, nestled in the Cascade foothills of Washington state. I rented it through a property management company while I finished a 3-year contract overseas. I'd finally come home. The overseas contract was done. My apartment lease had expired, and Cedar Pines was supposed to be my soft landing. A place to breathe, regroup, maybe stay permanently. I'd driven up alone on a Tuesday morning in October, windows down, thinking about nothing more complicated than which bedroom to sleep in first. The Cedar Pines Lake community was a private development of 62 homes clustered around Lake Harrow. It had a homeowners association, the Cedar Pines HOA, which, as far as I could tell from the management company's quarterly reports, had become increasingly aggressive over the past 18 months. My property manager, a quiet man named Dale Hutchins, had flagged a few notice of violation letters in his updates. I skimmed them. Unapproved dock stain color, unsanctioned wind chimes on a guest's rental, a fine for a rental vehicle parked in the wrong spot overnight. I'd authorized Dale to handle them. I trusted him. What I didn't know, what Dale had buried in a footnote of his last report, was that the HOA had changed its leadership 14 months ago. The new president was a woman named Patricia Holloway, and things had shifted considerably since she took the gavel. I learned about Patricia from my neighbor Tom Delaney before I even unloaded my car that Tuesday. Tom was 67. A retired mail carrier who lived 2 lots down and kept a meticulous vegetable garden along his back fence. He came over with a loaf of banana bread and a look on his face like a man about to warn you about a bad stretch of highway. "She runs this place like it's her personal fiefdom," Tom said, leaning against my porch railing with his arms crossed. Patricia Holloway moved in about 2 years ago, took over the HOA within 6 months. She's got 2 people on the board, her friend Donna and this guy Rick who just does whatever she says. 3 votes. That's all she needs. He described a community that had been, by most accounts, relaxed and friendly for years, until Patricia arrived with a 40-page revision of the community. Covenants she drafted herself, a new schedule of fines, and what Tom called an appetite for control that I have never seen outside of a very bad boss. Patricia Holloway was 54 years old. She had moved to Cedar Pines after a divorce that, according to Tom, had left her with a generous settlement, a 4-bedroom lakeside home, and apparently a great deal of free time. She had no children at the property, no job anyone knew of, and she spent her days managing the HOA like it was a full-time occupation. "She's got a notebook," Tom said, tapping his temple. "Documents everything. Photographs violations. She sent one family a cease and desist because their Halloween inflatable was 3 inches taller than the decoration height limit in Section 7 of the New Covenants. He paused. 3 inches, Mara. I unwrapped a piece of his banana bread and asked what she'd done to him personally. Tom's jaw tightened slightly. His garden, which he'd maintained for 11 years, had been cited for unapproved structural additions because he'd installed a second raised bed without submitting an architectural review application. The fine was $250. He'd paid it. Everyone paid. Not because the fines were uncontestable, most of them probably were, but because fighting Patricia Holloway meant attending HOA meetings where she controlled the agenda, the microphone, and, apparently, the thermostat. She turns the heat down when people stay too long, Tom told me. I laughed. He didn't. My property had been rented to a couple named the Garcias for the past 14 months. They'd been good tenants, quiet, clean, always on time with rent. Dale said they'd moved out in September, 2 weeks before my return, leaving the place in excellent shape. But they'd also, apparently, accumulated 8 HOA violation notices in 14 months. I pulled those notices out of the folder Dale had left on the kitchen counter. The citations ranged from the genuinely technical, a dock light left on past 10 p.m. in violation of the nighttime illumination ordinance, to the almost theatrical. One notice cited the Garcias for displaying culturally specific decorative items not consistent with the established aesthetic character of Cedar Pines community. I read that one 3 times. Culturally specific decorative items. The Garcias had hung a small ceramic sun, a Talavera sun about 8 inches across, beside their front door. Patricia had photographed it, cited the section of the covenants about exterior ornamentation, and fined them $175. The Garcias had taken the sun down the same day they received the notice. They hadn't put it back up. I set the folder down and looked out at the lake. The water was flat and silver in the October light. I thought about the Talavera sun. I thought about the Garcias quietly taking it down and folding it into a box. Something settled in my chest that felt like the opposite of relaxation. Dale had also left me a note, handwritten on a post-it stuck to the refrigerator, that said, Patricia H. knows the property changed hands/went off rental. She may reach out. She has been persistent. The ellipsis was doing a lot of work in that sentence. I'd been at the cabin about 40 minutes when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I was on the back porch with my coffee, watching a pair of mergansers cut across the lake, when I heard a car door slam with the precision of someone who wanted to be heard. I didn't turn around immediately. I finished watching the birds. When I came around to the front, I found a woman standing at the edge of my driveway. She was dressed in pressed khaki slacks and a fleece vest with the Cedar Pines HOA logo embroidered on the chest. She held a clipboard and wore reading glasses on a beaded chain. She was looking at my rental car, a gray Subaru with an Enterprise sticker on the bumper, with an expression of pure, undisguised contempt. "Can I help you?" I said. My tone was neutral. I'd spent 3 years negotiating engineering contracts in environments where showing irritation early cost you leverage. I knew how to be neutral. She looked at me with the slow, appraising look of someone who has already decided what category you fall into and is simply confirming their classification. "I'm Patricia Holloway," she said, as if announcing a diagnosis. "President of the Cedar Pines Homeowners Association. And you are?" "Mara Chen," I said. "I own this property." I didn't extend my hand. She didn't either. Patricia's eyes moved from my face to the Subaru to my luggage, which was still stacked on the porch. Her lips pressed together briefly. I was under the impression this property was being rented. I wasn't notified that the rental arrangement had ended or that the owner would be taking residence. "The property management company handles tenant notifications," I said. "But the property is mine. I'm the owner of record." I've lived or held this property for 3 years. I kept my voice even. Is there something specific I can help you with, Ms. Holloway? She produced a document from her clipboard. I have a few outstanding matters to discuss. The dock lighting ordinance. Your previous tenants accumulated $450 in fines that are still unpaid. There are also 2 open citation notices. And I'll need you to submit an owner occupancy notification form to the HOA within 48 hours of taking residence. That's Section 3, subsection F of the Community Covenants. I took the document she offered. It was a printed form titled Notice of Outstanding Obligations and Required Filings. Cedar Pines HOA. It was 3 pages long and had my address printed at the top in bold. She had come prepared. She had been waiting for this moment. I scanned the document. The fines from the Garcias tenancy were listed with dates and violation codes. The dock light, $200. The unapproved deck furniture arrangement, $150. The culturally specific ornamentation, $175. A late fee tacked on to each. Total outstanding, $617.50. I'll look into these with my property manager, I said. The balance is due within 30 days, Patricia said, recapping her pen with a small, satisfying click. If it's not paid, the HOA has the authority under our governing documents to place a lien on the property. Just so you're aware. She said it pleasantly. The pleasantness was the worst part. I'm aware of how HOA liens work, I said. I'm also aware that some of these citations may not have been properly issued. I'll review them. Something shifted in Patricia's posture. Barely perceptible, just a slight squaring of the shoulders, the way a person adjusts when they realize their opponent isn't going to fold immediately. The citations were all properly documented and photographed, she said. The HOA board reviewed each one. If you'd like to contest them, there's a formal appeals process, Section 12 of the Covenants. You have 14 days to file. The form is on the HOA website. She tucked her clipboard under her arm. Welcome to Cedar Pines, Ms. Chun. She turned and walked back to her car. A white Lexus SUV parked at a precise angle at the edge of my driveway. She drove away without looking back. I stood on my porch holding the notice of outstanding obligations and thought about the $617.50 and whether I was going to write a check or make a phone call. I decided on the phone call first. Dale Hutchins picked up on the second ring. When I described Patricia's visit, there was a long pause. Yeah, he said finally. She's been escalating. I probably should have told you more in the reports. She's had it out for your property since the Garcias got that Ceramic Sun citation. I think she thought they'd just sell or I'd pull the rental. Why would she want the property vacant? I asked. Dale paused again. I don't know for certain, but Tom Delaney thinks she has a buyer, somebody she knows, who's been interested in acquiring one of the lots on the East Shore. Your property is East Shore, Mara. Prime dock access. I let that sit for a moment. Send me everything, Dale. Every notice, every letter, every photo she's filed. Within the hour, Dale sent me a PDF folder with 47 pages of documentation. I sat at the kitchen table and read every page. The pattern was clear once you laid it out chronologically. The violations against my property had accelerated after Patricia took office. They peaked when the Garcias lease was up for renewal, and the Garcias had chosen not to renew, citing, according to Dale's notes, a stressful and unwelcoming community environment. There was also a letter in the folder, dated 8 months prior, from Patricia to Dale, copied to the HOA's attorney, suggesting that the property had been improperly registered as a short-term rental in violation of Cedar Pines community standards. This was demonstrably false. The property was a long-term rental. The covenants permitted it, but she had put it in writing to a lawyer. I called my own attorney. Her name was Linda Park, and she'd handled my real estate closing 3 years ago. I gave her the condensed version. She asked me to send her the folder. 20 minutes later, she called me back and said, "Mara, this is a harassment pattern, not a slam dunk. HOAs have broad authority in Washington, but this is documented, targeted escalation. The misrepresentation to the attorney is potentially actionable." "Good to know," I said. "What do I do right now?" "Document everything going forward," Linda said. "Don't pay the fines yet, not until we review each citation. Don't engage emotionally with this woman, and get your hands on the current version of those covenants. She may have amended things she wasn't authorized to change." I wrote it all down. That evening, I walked over to Tom's place for dinner. He'd invited me when he dropped off the banana bread, and I was glad I'd accepted. His wife Helen had made pot roast, and there were 2 other neighbors at the table, a woman named Bev Kowalski and a man named James Okafor, both of whom owned properties on the North Shore. Over dinner, I heard the fuller story of Cedar Pines under Patricia's tenure. Bev had received a notice for the color of her garden hose reel, not an approved neutral tone. James had been fined for having a kayak stored on the side of his house rather than in an approved rack enclosure. Tom's raised bed was already legend. There were others. "She targets people she doesn't like," Helen said, passing the gravy. "And the people she doesn't like tend to follow a pattern." She said it plainly, without elaboration, and nobody at the table needed her to elaborate. I looked at my plate. James Okafor looked at the table. Bev Kowalski refilled her water glass. "Has anyone fought back formally?" I asked. James nodded. "Couple tried last spring, the Hendersons on the West Shore. Filed a formal appeal on a fence violation. Patricia recused herself from the vote, but Donna and Rick upheld the fine 3-0. Then 2 weeks later, the Hendersons got a new notice. Different violation, but same property." He shrugged. "They paid it. Nobody's going to the county?" I asked. Tom shrugged. "A few people have looked into it. The problem is, everything she does is technically within the HOA's authority, or close enough to it that a county complaint doesn't get traction. She knows exactly how far she can push before it crosses a legal line. That's the thing about Patricia. She's not stupid. She's strategic," Helen said quietly. That word, strategic, stayed with me through the drive home. I sat on my porch after dinner with a glass of wine and looked out at the dark water and thought about the difference between someone who was difficult and someone who was strategic. The first you could wait out. The second required a different approach. The next morning, I submitted the owner-occupancy notification form. I sent it by email with red receipt, certified mail, and fax. 3 delivery methods, all with timestamps. Linda had suggested the overkill. "She's the type to claim she never received it," Linda said. I also attached a formal notice that I would be reviewing all outstanding citations and requested copies of the original photographic evidence within 10 business days per the covenants. Patricia's response came within 4 hours. By email, formal in tone. "Ms. Chun, the owner-occupancy form has been received and logged. Regarding your request for citation evidence, please note that evidence files are available for review by appointment at the HOA Administrative Office during posted hours. Tuesday and Thursday, 2 to 4 p.m. walk-ins are not permitted." The administrative office, I would learn, was the spare bedroom of Patricia's house. I made an appointment for the following Thursday. In the meantime, I walked every inch of my property with my phone, photographing everything: the dock, the deck furniture, the exterior lighting, the siding, the landscaping. I wanted a baseline. I wanted to know what condition everything was in before Patricia decided to generate new violations. I sent the photos to Linda and to Dale. Thursday arrived. I drove to Patricia's house at 2 p.m. exactly. Her home was immaculate. A 4-bedroom craftsman with a sweeping lake view, professional landscaping, and a small brass plaque beside the door that read, Cedar Pines HOA. She answered the door in the khaki and fleece combination, clipboard in hand, as if she'd been assembled and deployed. The administrative office was exactly what I'd expected. A spare bedroom with a folding table, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, and a printer. There was a framed copy of the Cedar Pines Covenants on the wall and a whiteboard with a calendar of upcoming enforcement actions. She had a schedule of enforcement actions on a whiteboard in her guest room. She walked me through each citation with the meticulous care of someone who had rehearsed this presentation. She had photographs dated, annotated, cross-referenced to covenant sections. The dock light, the deck furniture, the Talavera sun, each one documented with an almost disturbing thoroughness. I took notes. I did not give her any visible reaction. When she finished, I asked 3 questions. First, had the board voted to approve each fine individually, as required by Section 8 of the Covenants, or had Patricia issued them unilaterally? She said the board had ratified them at regular meetings. Second, could I see the meeting minutes? She said they were available on the HOA website. Third, was the website current? She said yes. That evening I went to the HOA website. It was last updated 7 months ago. The meeting minutes posted covered only through March of the current year. The citations on my property ran through September. I forwarded this observation to Linda. Linda said, "Interesting." That was the word Linda used when something was going to be useful later. 2 weeks into my residency, Patricia issued me a new citation. I found it in my mailbox on a Monday morning, a formal notice, printed on HOA letterhead, informing me that my rental vehicle, the Enterprise Subaru, constituted a commercial or temporary use vehicle and violated Section 5B of the parking regulations, which prohibited such vehicles from being parked in driveways for more than 72 consecutive hours. I had owned the car for 11 days. I photographed the notice, sent it to Linda, and returned the rental car that afternoon and bought a used Jeep Cherokee from a dealer in town. I did this not because the citation was valid, Linda thought it probably wasn't, but because I wasn't going to fight a parking battle while I was trying to build the larger case. Pick your terrain. The Jeep was 3 years old, navy blue, clean. I parked it in the driveway. Within 48 hours, I had a new notice in my mailbox. This one-cited Section 5C vehicles must be parked entirely within the paved surface of the designated parking area. My Jeep's rear left tire was, according to Patricia's photograph, approximately 4 inches onto the gravel shoulder beside the driveway. 4 inches. I measured it myself with a tape measure. She was right, technically, by about 3.5 inches. I repositioned the Jeep 2 feet forward. The following morning, I found a fresh citation for the dock. A new one, different from the previous dock light violations. This one said the dock's structural decking had a visible deterioration inconsistent with community maintenance standards and required remediation within 30 days. I walked to the dock with my phone and took photographs. The decking was in good condition. One board had a small surface crack, cosmetic, not structural, the kind of thing you'd expect on any weathered wood dock. I called Dale. He'd had the dock inspected 8 months ago. The inspection report was clean. I sent that report to Patricia by certified mail and email. She did not respond. What she did instead was file a formal complaint with the HOA board requesting a mandatory property inspection. The notification arrived by certified mail 4 days later. Per Section 14 of the Covenants, the HOA had the right to conduct a property inspection with 48 hours' notice when a formal maintenance complaint had been filed. The inspection was scheduled for the following Wednesday at 10 a.m. I called Linda. "Let her inspect," Linda said. Your property is in great shape. Let her come and find nothing. We document it, her arrival time, what she looks at, what she says, what she finds. Every minute of that inspection is data. I agreed. I also called Tom that evening. She's inspecting you? He said. She's only ever done that to the Hendersons. Right before she tried to get them to sell. Wednesday arrived. Patricia showed up at 10:01 with a woman I didn't recognize. Short, brown hair, enormous sunglasses, carrying her own clipboard. Patricia introduced her as Donna, our board secretary. Donna smiled in the tight, apologetic way of someone who knows they're part of something they can't quite defend but has committed anyway. I walked them through the property systematically. Exterior, deck, dock, interior perimeter. I said nothing unless asked a direct question. Patricia documented everything with her phone camera. She spent 4 minutes on the dock decking, crouching to photograph the cracked board from multiple angles. She spent 2 minutes on the exterior paint near the waterline on the north side of the cabin and murmured something to Donna about UV degradation. When they finished, Patricia produced a preliminary checklist and informed me that the HOA would issue a formal inspection report within 10 business days. She noted, verbally, that she had concerns about the dock decking and the north side exterior paint. I asked her to define concerns in writing. She said the report would do so. They left. I hired an independent property inspector that afternoon. A licensed one, not affiliated with the HOA. His report came back within 3 days. The property was in excellent condition. The dock decking crack was cosmetic, no structural compromise. The north side paint showed normal weathering for the age of the structure and climate exposure. No remediation required by any reasonable standard. I sent Patricia a copy of the independent report before the HOA's own report arrived. Her response, when it came, 10 days later, 1 day before the deadline, cited differing standards of assessment and upheld the concern about the dock decking, assigning a remediation requirement within 60 days with a $500 fine for deferred maintenance. The exterior paint issue was downgraded to a monitoring notice, which was not a fine but was logged in my property file. Linda reviewed the HOA report and said, "This is overreach. The fine is almost certainly not supportable if you appeal. But here's the thing, she's building a file on your property. Every citation, every fine, every notice goes into a community record. If she can make your property look like a chronic violation property, she has a stronger argument for enforcement actions down the road, including, theoretically, foreclosure proceedings on an HOA lien." I sat with that word for a moment. Foreclosure. She can't actually foreclose on a property over a $500 dock fine, I said. Not overnight, Linda said carefully. But HOA lien law in Washington is powerful. If fines accumulate, go unpaid, and the HOA follows procedure, they can move toward a forced sale to satisfy the lien. It takes time and it requires them to follow the procedure exactly. But it can happen. The room felt suddenly smaller. I appealed the dock fine. I filed the appeal form, attached the independent inspection report, and submitted both by certified mail and email within the 14-day window. I also submitted a public records request to the Cedar Pines HOA, which was a registered nonprofit, for all board meeting minutes, voting records, and financial records for the past 24 months. This was permitted under Washington nonprofit law. Patricia's response to the public records request was a letter stating that the records would be made available at a mutually convenient time and suggesting I schedule an appointment at the administrative office. I pointed out, via Linda, that Washington law required the documents to be produced within a reasonable time and that mutually convenient was not the legal standard. We set a deadline. Meanwhile, I started talking to more of my neighbors. Not just Tom and Bev and James. I started walking the community, introducing myself, asking people how things were going. I discovered that Cedar Pines had 62 properties. Of those, approximately 30 had received at least one HOA citation in the past 14 months. 22 had paid fines without appeal. 3 had successfully appealed. 7 were in various states of ongoing dispute with Patricia. I also discovered something that Tom hadn't mentioned, possibly because he didn't know. One of the 7 people in ongoing disputes was a woman named Cynthia Marsh, who lived on the South Shore. Cynthia was a retired paralegal. She had been fighting Patricia for 9 months over a fence height dispute, and in the course of that fight, she had accumulated something I was very interested in, a paper trail. I visited Cynthia on a rainy Thursday afternoon. She was 63, sharp-eyed, and had the particular energy of someone who has spent years watching other people underestimate her. She made green tea and set a 3-inch thick binder on her kitchen table. "I've been waiting for someone to come knock on my door," she said. I was starting to think nobody was going to. Cynthia's binder contained, among other things, a discovery she had made 8 months ago. Patricia Holloway had amended the Cedar Pines covenants, not once, but 3 times, in the past 14 months. Each amendment had been approved by the 3-member board. But the original covenants required a 60% supermajority of all homeowners to ratify amendments to the core governing documents. Patricia had changed the rules by board vote. 3 people, 62 properties. She changed the parking regulations, Cynthia said, tapping a page in the binder. She changed the maintenance standards. She added the exterior ornamentation section, the one that got the Garcia son taken down. She added the mandatory property inspection provision. She added the enforcement escalation schedule that allows fines to compound. All of it in 14 months without a homeowner vote. She looked at me steadily. Every fine she's issued under those amended sections is probably void. I stared at the binder. Why hasn't anyone done anything with this? I asked. Cynthia looked at me with a patience that suggested she had asked herself the same question. Because fighting an HOA is expensive, time-consuming, and most people here are retired or working full-time with families. Patricia knows that. She knows the math. She knows that even if you're right, most people will pay $250 and move on rather than spend 18 months and $5,000 in legal fees to prove it. She paused. Are you most people, Mara? I looked at the binder. I thought about the Talavera son. I thought about the Garcias quietly folding it into a box. No, I said. I'm not. Cynthia smiled for the first time. It was a small smile, but it was real. She handed me a USB drive. I've digitized everything. Take it, and get your lawyer on the phone. I called Linda that evening. When I described the unauthorized covenant amendments, there was a silence on Linda's end that I had learned to recognize as the silence of a lawyer recalibrating the value of a case. Mara, she said finally, if those amendments weren't properly ratified, and it sounds like they weren't, then every enforcement action taken under those sections is potentially void. Every fine, every lien. She paused again. Every lien. How do we prove it? I asked. Get me the original recorded covenants from the county recorder's office, not from Patricia's version on the website, and get me the HOA's own records of the amendment process which you're already requesting, and Cynthia Marsh's documentation. She was typing as she spoke. We may be looking at a lawsuit, Mara, not just a fine appeal. I went to the county recorder's office the next morning. The original Cedar Pines covenants were filed in 2001 when the community was established. I paid for certified copies of every recorded document related to Cedar Pines. The clerk, a young woman named Amy who had the efficiency of someone who'd been doing this job for 30 years, produced a stack an inch thick. I carried it to a coffee shop and read for 4 hours. The original covenants were clear. Core governing documents required a 60% homeowner vote for amendment. Board resolutions could handle administrative matters, meeting schedules, contractor approvals, minor procedural updates. They could not change parking regulations, maintenance standards, fine schedules, or enforcement procedures. Patricia had changed all of those by board vote. 3 people, without notice to homeowners, without a vote. I photographed every page and sent the files to Linda. Then I drove home and sat on my dock in the October cold and looked at the lake and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Calm. Not the forced calm of someone suppressing anger. The genuine calm of someone who finally understands the terrain they're standing on and knows, for the first time, exactly where the high ground is. But Patricia wasn't done. 3 days after my trip to the county recorder, I found a notice on my door. Not in the mailbox, on the door, taped directly to it, which somehow felt more aggressive, informing me that my appeal of the dock fine had been reviewed by the board and denied. The vote had been 2-1, Donna and Rick upholding, with a notation that the dissenting vote was not recorded per board procedural rules. I called Cynthia. "Of course she doesn't record dissenting votes," Cynthia said. "She edits the minutes." The appeal denial meant the $500 fine was now final. A late fee of $75 had been added. Patricia's letter noted that if the fine was not paid within 30 days, it would be referred to the HOA's collections attorney. I sent the letter to Linda. Linda said, "Don't pay it. We're going to contest all of this, and paying it might be interpreted as acknowledging the validity of the fine." I didn't pay it. Meanwhile, the HOA documents I'd requested under the nonprofit records law arrived partially. What Patricia provided was a selective package. Meeting agendas, but not minutes. Treasurer's reports, for the current year only, and a copy of the current covenants, her amended version. What was missing? The actual meeting minutes for the past 24 months, the voting records for the amendment adoptions, and any financial records prior to 14 months ago. Linda drafted a demand letter citing the specific statutory violations. Patricia's response, through the HOA attorney, was to request a 30-day extension. "She's stalling," Linda said. "She's either cleaning up the records or hoping you'll run out of patience." "She doesn't know me very well," I said. "No," Linda agreed. "She doesn't." We denied the extension request. We gave her 10 days and noted that failure to produce the records would result in a filing with the Washington State Attorney General's office, which has jurisdiction over nonprofit governance violations. During this period, I had been attending HOA meetings, the regular monthly meeting and a special meeting Patricia called to address community maintenance standards. Patricia ran the meetings with practiced efficiency. Agenda printed and distributed, timer on discussions, Robert's rules invoked selectively. When I raised the question of the amendment ratification process at the regular meeting, she ruled it not relevant to the current agenda item and moved on before I could respond. But other homeowners had started listening. I could see it in the small shifts. Neighbors who'd sat in the back with their arms folded now sitting forward, watching Patricia's face when I spoke. Tom caught my eye across the room and gave me the smallest nod. Cynthia, seated 3 chairs to my right, had her binder on her lap. We hadn't coordinated. We didn't need to. After the meeting, 4 homeowners I didn't know approached me in the parking lot. A couple named Vasquez who'd been fighting a fence citation for 3 months. A man named Pruitt who'd received a fine for his boat cover. A woman named Atkins who'd been cited for a wind chime, the same category as the Garcias. All of them wanted to know what I was doing and whether they could help. I told them to start documenting everything. They said they already were. I had been at Cedar Pines for exactly 1 month when Patricia knocked on my door on a Saturday morning, unannounced, with Rick, the 3rd board member, standing slightly behind her. Rick was 40-something, with the look of a man who had agreed to something once and was now too deep in to reconsider. He nodded at me. He did not speak. Patricia informed me that the HOA had voted to engage an outside contractor to evaluate the dock decking, at my expense per Section 14(d) of the covenants, since I had disputed the findings of the authorized inspection. She presented me with a written authorization form for the contractor to access the property. The fee, $350, payable to the HOA upon completion. I took the form. I read it on the spot, which I could tell annoyed her by the way she shifted her clipboard. Section 14(d) did allow for a third-party evaluation, but it also specified that the contractor had to be a licensed dock and marine structure specialist, and that the homeowner had the right to be present during the evaluation. I'll need the contractor's license number and certification before I sign this, I said. Patricia said she would provide it. She left without it. 3 days later, she sent me the contractor information by email. I looked up the license number on the Washington State Contractor Database. The contractor, a company called Cascade Property Services, was licensed, but not specifically as a marine structure specialist. Their license category was General Property Maintenance. I forwarded this to Linda, who wrote to Patricia noting the covenant discrepancy and requesting a properly qualified contractor. Patricia did not respond for a week. When she did respond, it was not about the contractor. It was a new notice, my fourth in 5 weeks, citing Section 11(a) of the covenants. Homeowners engaged in active disputes with the HOA are required to communicate exclusively through the formal HOA dispute communication channel and may not discuss matters under dispute with other community members in a manner that could constitute harassment or interference with HOA governance. I read it twice. She was trying to prohibit me from talking to my neighbors. I sent the notice to Linda. She was quiet for a moment. "This is remarkable," she said, and I could hear the particular flatness in her voice that meant she was genuinely surprised. "She can't enforce that. Freedom of speech, association rights, this would never hold up. But the fact that she issued it tells us something." "What?" I asked. "She's worried," Linda said. "Something you're doing is making her worried." I sat with that for a day. I didn't call any neighbors that week, not out of compliance with Patricia's absurd notice, but because I was thinking. I needed to understand what she was actually afraid of. Not the lawsuit, that was building slowly, and she probably didn't know how far along it was. Something more immediate. Something in my daily presence was unsettling her. Tom brought it into focus over coffee one morning. He'd heard, through Bev Kowalski, who'd heard from a woman on the West Shore, that Patricia had recently had a meeting with a man named Gerald Finch, a real estate developer who owned a management company in Bellevue. Tom had seen Finch's car at Patricia's house twice in the past 2 months. "She's not just managing the HOA," Tom said. "She's managing something for someone." I looked up Gerald Finch. He wasn't hard to find. He had a LinkedIn profile, a company website, and a portfolio that included several lifestyle community developments, planned residential areas around Pacific Northwest lakes. His company, Finch Group, had purchased 2 troubled HOA communities in the past 4 years, bought out several properties within them at below market prices, and converted the communities to higher-end managed developments. Both communities had histories of HOA enforcement campaigns in the years before Finch arrived. I pulled the county property records for Cedar Pines. In the past 14 months, exactly the window of Patricia's HOA presidency, 6 properties in the community had been sold. 3 were sold after HOA lien disputes. All 6 had sold at prices between 12% and 23% below comparable recent sales in the surrounding Lake District. All 6 buyers, I discovered after an hour of research, were LLCs. 3 of those LLCs shared a registered agent address in Bellevue. I pulled the registered agent's address. It matched the suite number for Finch Group. Patricia wasn't just managing the HOA, she was softening properties for Finch, running up fines and violations until owners got tired and sold cheap, and Finch's entities were there to buy. I sat at my kitchen table with the property records spread in front of me and felt the whole architecture of it settle into place with a cold, clean clarity. I called Linda. I gave her Finch's name and the LLC connection. There was that silence again, longer this time. "Mara," she said when she came back, "if this is what it looks like, we're not just talking about HOA governance violations. We're potentially talking about a coordinated scheme to depress property values and acquire properties at a discount. That's not just a civil HOA matter. That could be wire fraud. That could be a state AG matter. That could be federal." My kitchen was very quiet. "What do I do?" I said. Linda's answer was immediate. "You keep being methodical. You don't tip her off. You don't change your behavior. You keep requesting records, you keep filing appeals, you keep documenting. And you let me make some calls." I agreed. I said nothing to anyone for 3 days. Not Tom, not Cynthia, not any of the parking lot homeowners. I sat on my dock in the November cold and watched the lake and waited. In those 3 quiet days, something unexpected happened. A woman knocked on my door on a Tuesday evening. She was in her late 30s, dark hair, paint-stained jeans. She introduced herself as Sofia Garcia. The wife of the couple who had been my tenants, who had taken down the Talavera sun. I stood in my doorway and didn't know what to say for a full 3 seconds. She'd heard I was back. She'd heard, from someone in the community, she wasn't specific, that I was fighting the HOA. She came because she wanted to tell me something she'd never told Dale. "We left because of her," Sophia said, standing on my porch with her hands in her jacket pockets. But it wasn't just the fines. She came to the door one night, Patricia, and she told my husband that there had been community concerns raised about short-term rental properties, and that it would be better for everyone if we resolved our residency situation voluntarily. Sophia looked at me steadily. She told us we didn't fit. I looked at Sofia Garcia and thought about the Talavera sun and the way it had been photographed and cited and documented and used to make a family feel like they didn't belong. "I'm sorry," I said. "You shouldn't have had to leave." She nodded once, quickly, the nod of someone who had processed this already and come out the other side. She handed me a folded paper. "My husband kept her visit dated and written down," she said. "He's an accountant. He documents things." I unfolded the paper. It was a signed, dated account of Patricia's visit to the Garcia home, what she'd said word for word. I held the paper in both hands for a moment. Then I thanked Sofia Garcia, and after she left, I sat down at the kitchen table and added her husband's account to the growing file. I thought about the phrase "resolved our residency situation" and what a lawyer would make of it. I thought about what Linda would say when I sent it to her. I already knew. She would say, "Interesting." The calm ended on a Wednesday morning in November when I found a bright orange notice stapled to my front door. Not taped, stapled with a staple gun. The paper was thick, heavy stock, printed in bold. "Notice of formal HOA enforcement action." Below that, in smaller text, "This property has been placed on the Cedar Pines HOA Enforcement Registry pending resolution of outstanding violations. Per Section 16(c) of Community Covenants, properties on the Enforcement Registry are subject to enhanced monitoring and compliance review." I photographed the notice, removed it carefully, and called Linda before I'd even had coffee. She told me to look up Section 16(c) in the original recorded covenants. I already knew what I'd find. Section 16(c) didn't exist in the original document. Patricia had invented it in her unauthorized amendments. "She's escalating," Linda said. "She's putting pressure on you before we file." She doesn't know we're about to file, but she can tell you're not capitulating and she's trying to force the issue. When are we filing? I asked. I need 3 more weeks to get the complaint fully documented, Linda said. Can you hold? I can hold, I said, but holding turned out to be harder than I'd anticipated. Because Patricia, it seemed, had also decided she was done being patient. 2 days after the stapled notice, I received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney, a man named Warren Stiles, at a firm in Bellevue. The letter informed me that the Cedar Pines HOA was formally pursuing collection of $1,242.50 in outstanding fines and fees, the Garcias original balance plus my own accumulated citations, and that if payment was not received within 15 days, the HOA would file a lien against the property. The letter was 5 pages and included a copy of every citation with dates and violation codes. I read the letter at my kitchen table and did the math. $1,242.50 against a property worth, per the county assessor's most recent valuation, $687,000. A lien for $1,242.50 wouldn't come close to threatening ownership. But it would cloud the title. It would complicate any refinancing or sale. And once it was on record, it became part of the property's legal history, the kind of thing Patricia could point to as evidence that this was a chronic violation property. A Finch Group discount justifier. I sent Stiles's letter to Linda and then did something I hadn't done in weeks. I made a pot of coffee, carried it to the dock, and sat in the November cold for an hour without my phone. I watched a heron stand motionless in the shallows at the north end of the cove. I thought about patience. The heron didn't move for 40 minutes. When it finally struck, it was over in less than a second. Linda filed her response to Stiles the following Monday. It was a 12-page letter that did 3 things. Formally contested every citation as void under the original covenants, notified the HOA that all enforcement actions taken under unauthorized covenant amendments were legally defective, and informed both the HOA and its attorney that our client intended to file a civil lawsuit in King County Superior Court within 30 days seeking declaratory relief, injunctive relief, and damages. She CC'd the Washington State Attorney General's office on the letter's cover page. The response from Stiles was silence for 5 days. Then a single email. He was requesting a 2-week extension to review the matter with his client. Linda replied that we would not oppose a reasonable extension for settlement discussions if the HOA agreed to suspend all enforcement actions and fine accrual during the review period. Stiles said he'd discuss it with his client. The reply, when it came, was a no. Patricia had apparently told him not to agree. Patricia was at my door the following morning at 8:30. She wore a coat over her usual khaki and fleece combination, which meant she had come before she'd fully composed herself. Coat without the vest was a tell. She stood on my porch with her clipboard and looked at me with an expression that was trying very hard to be professional and was not quite making it. There was something in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly, closer to fear. She covered it quickly. "Ms. Chun," she said, "I think it would be beneficial if we had a direct conversation about the current situation, without attorneys involved." I looked at her for a moment. "My attorney has advised me not to discuss matters under litigation directly with the HOA or its representatives," I said. This was technically true. Linda had said exactly that. "We've received your attorney's letter," Patricia said, "and I want you to understand that the HOA has the full support of the community in these enforcement actions." "Does it?" I said. I kept my voice mild. Patricia's jaw tightened slightly. "Yes, this isn't personal, Ms. Chun. The HOA exists to maintain community standards and property values for the benefit of everyone here." "Interesting framing," I said. I didn't elaborate. The silence between us was about 5 seconds long and felt like considerably more. Then she left. I watched her Lexus pull out of my driveway and thought about the coat without vest and the fear she'd been covering and the phrase, full support of the community. I thought about the 6 families who'd sold and moved. The Garcias. Tom's raised bed. Cynthia's binder. I wondered if Patricia believed her own framing or if she'd simply repeated it enough times that it had become load-bearing in her version of events. 3 days later, James Okafor knocked on my door. He looked uncomfortable in the specific way of someone carrying news they'd rather not be the one to deliver. He came inside and I made tea and he told me what he'd heard. Patricia had called an emergency HOA meeting. Not the regular monthly meeting, an emergency special session, for the following Saturday. The stated purpose, per her email to the community, formal review of chronic violation properties and potential enforcement escalation recommendations. Chronic violation properties, I said. James nodded. You and Cynthia and the Vasquez family are all on her list. She's going to propose something at this meeting, Mara. I don't know exactly what, but she's been calling people, trying to build support. He paused. She called me, tried to get me to come out against you. I told her I had a prior commitment. He looked at his tea. I'm sorry I haven't been more open about supporting you. I've been worried about my own situation. Don't apologize, I said. You're here now. He nodded, relieved. We sat with that for a moment. Then he told me something else. Something he'd overheard at the Lakeside Common area the previous weekend. Patricia had been talking to Donna in a low voice, unaware that James was on the far side of the boathouse. Patricia had said, in reference to the lawsuit letter, "It doesn't matter what she files. Stiles says they don't have the standing for the amendment challenge. By the time it works through court, we'll have the lien. And once there's a lien, Finch can make an offer." James hadn't caught the name clearly. He thought it was Finch. I told him yes, that was exactly right. I called Linda immediately after James left. I told her what he'd overheard. She asked if he'd write it down with a date and sign it. I called James back. He said yes without hesitation. The account signed and delivered to Linda that afternoon was another data point, this one documenting Patricia explicitly referencing Finch by name in connection with the lien strategy. The puzzle was assembling itself with remarkable efficiency. I attended the emergency HOA meeting on Saturday. The Cedar Pines Community Center was a low-slung building with folding chairs and fluorescent lights. It held about 40 people. 51 showed up. I had not organized this. I had simply mentioned to Tom and Cynthia and James and the Vasquez family and Bev Kowalski and a handful of others that the meeting was happening and that it seemed important to attend. Word had traveled. Patricia had not expected 51 people. I could see the recalculation happen in real time as she looked up from her agenda notes and counted the chairs. She recovered smoothly, called the meeting to order, read the agenda, established quorum. She was good at this. She was comfortable at a podium. The room felt different to her than she'd planned, but she was going to proceed. Her proposal was presented under the agenda item, Long-Term Enforcement Strategy for Repeat Violation Properties. She read it from a prepared document. The HOA board was recommending the formal designation of 3 properties, mine, Cynthia's, and the Vasquez property, as habitual violation properties. Under this designation, a property could be subject to accelerated lien timelines, enhanced inspection frequency, and the phrase she delivered with studied calm, potential enforcement referral for community standards review. She didn't define community standards review. When Cynthia raised her hand and asked what it meant, Patricia said it referred to a formal process outlined in Section 18B of the Community Covenants. Cynthia asked which version of the covenants. Patricia said the current version. Cynthia opened her binder and said, Section 18B of the original recorded covenants, filed with King County in 2001, does not exist. Would you like to explain that discrepancy to the board? The room got very quiet. Patricia said that the covenants had been updated by the board, as the board had authority to do. Cynthia said, the original covenants require a 60% homeowner vote to amend core governing documents. Can you show us the results of that vote? Patricia said the legal question of amendment authority was under review. Cynthia said, under review by whom? Patricia said, our attorney. Cynthia said, your attorney received a letter 2 weeks ago citing this exact issue. What has he told you? Patricia said she wasn't going to discuss legal matters in an open meeting. The room was no longer quiet. Voices came from all directions. The Vasquez couple standing in the back asked about their fence fine. The woman named Atkins asked about her wind chime citation. A man I didn't know, wearing a University of Washington sweatshirt, said he'd been fined for the color of his mailbox and asked if that was also under an amended section. Tom Delaney raised his hand and said, point of order. If the amendment process wasn't valid, aren't all these fines void? Patricia called for order. She called for it 3 times. Rick, the third board member, was sitting to Patricia's right. I watched him during the chaos. His posture had changed. He'd started the meeting leaned back, arms loosely crossed, the body language of someone who expects to be there for an hour of routine. Now he was forward, elbows on the table, watching Patricia's face with the focused attention of a man revising his options in real time. Patricia restored order by invoking meeting conduct rules and threatening to end the session early. The room quieted partially. She returned to her proposal. She called for a board vote on the habitual violation property designation. She and Donna raised their hands. There was a long beat. Patricia looked at Rick. Rick looked at the ceiling. Then he looked at the room. Then he said, I abstain. Patricia's composure cracked for exactly 1.8 seconds. Her eyes went to Rick with an expression that someone kinder than me might call wounded. Then she collected herself and announced, motion passes 2-1 with 1 abstention. The designation is approved. She banged the gavel before anyone could respond. She moved immediately to the next agenda item. I drove home from the meeting and sat in my car in the driveway for 10 minutes, replaying what had happened. Rick's abstention wasn't a full defection. He hadn't voted against her. But it was the first crack. And the room, the 51 people in the room, was a different thing than 51 separate homeowners each calculating their individual risk. In that room, for those 90 minutes, they had been something closer to a community. Patricia had looked out at that room and seen something shift, and she had felt it. Linda called me the next morning. She had heard from Warren Stiles. Patricia apparently wanted a settlement meeting. In person, without attorneys, Patricia's request. Linda said absolutely not. Attorneys must be present. Stiles said he'd try. The counteroffer. Attorneys present but off the record. Preliminary only. Linda agreed to a preliminary meeting. It was set for Thursday afternoon in a conference room at Stiles's Bellevue office. I drove to Bellevue on Thursday in the Cherokee with Linda. Stiles's firm was on the 14th floor with a view of Bellevue's skyline. Warren Stiles was in his 50s, experienced, the kind of lawyer who'd sat through hundreds of disputes and knew where they were headed within the first 10 minutes. He looked at our 12-page letter and looked at Patricia, and I saw that same look Rick had given, the look of someone silently revising their options. Patricia sat across the table from me in a charcoal blazer, hair pinned back precisely, no clipboard. This was her formal version. She opened with a prepared statement about her commitment to the Cedar Pines community and her desire to resolve the situation constructively. When she finished, I looked at Linda. Linda set a manila folder on the table. Inside were copies of everything: the original covenants, the unauthorized amendments, the LLC property purchases cross-reference to Finch Group, James's signed account, Sofia Garcia's husband's account. We laid them out one by one. Patricia didn't flinch through most of it. She was good. She watched each document get placed on the table with the expression of someone watching a weather forecast for a city they don't live in. But when Linda placed the document cross-referencing the LLC property purchases to Finch Group, when that one landed on the table, Patricia's right hand moved involuntarily to her collar. Just for a moment. Then she put her hand back on the table and looked at Stiles. Stiles looked at the document for a long time. Then he said quietly, "I think we should take a 10-minute break." Patricia looked at him sharply. He met her eyes and gave the smallest shake of his head. They stepped out together. Linda and I stayed in the conference room. We didn't talk. We looked at the documents on the table and the view of the skyline, and we waited. They came back in 8 minutes. Stiles said, "My client is willing to discuss a settlement framework." Patricia's face was very still. "Great," Linda said. "Let's start with dismissal of all enforcement actions, refund of all fines paid by homeowners under the unauthorized amended sections, resignation from the HOA board, and a full public accounting of the HOA's finances for the past 24 months. There was a silence. Stiles looked at Patricia. Patricia said, "No. Then we'll see you in court," Linda said pleasantly, and began gathering the documents from the table. Stiles put up a hand. "Let's not end this now. There may be a middle ground." "There isn't," Linda said. "But we're willing to revisit in 30 days if circumstances change." She stood up. I stood up. We took our documents. We said goodbye to Stiles. Patricia did not say anything. Her eyes were fixed on a point somewhere above my left shoulder, and her jaw was set, and I knew, looking at her in that moment, that she was not going to accept a settlement. She was going to fight. And I knew just as clearly that she was going to lose. Patricia moved faster than I expected. Within 48 hours of the Bellevue meeting, the HOA filed the lien. Not a notice of intent, the actual lien recorded with King County. $1,242.50. My name, my address, filed and publicly recorded. Linda called me when it hit the county system. "She's panicking," Linda said. "This is a panic move. She knows the amendment challenge is serious, and she's trying to establish the lien before we can get a court order." "Can she?" I asked. "She just did," Linda said. "But we're filing for injunctive relief tomorrow morning. Judge will hear it within the week." The lien was public. By noon that day, for homeowners had texted me about it, Tom, Cynthia, James, and the woman named Adkins. By evening, it had been discussed in the Cedar Pines Facebook group, which I joined but never posted in. A woman I'd never met, Karen Osgood, North Shore, posted, "Can the HOA really put a lien on your house for a cracked dock board? Asking because I have 2 cracked dock boards." The response thread had 42 comments by midnight. The filing of the lien also triggered something Linda had anticipated but not guaranteed. Stiles withdrew from the matter. His letter to the HOA arrived, copied to Linda 2 days after the lien filing. He cited irreconcilable differences in strategic approach and developments inconsistent with the scope of representation. Translation: he'd seen the Finch Group connection and didn't want to be anywhere near it. Patricia was now without a lawyer. She found a new one within a week. A younger attorney named Carmichael who practiced out of a small firm in Renton. His initial communication was aggressive. A letter contesting our injunction motion, arguing that the lien was validly filed and the covenant amendments were properly executed by duly elected board members. Linda read it and said, "He hasn't seen our county records documentation yet. He will." She was right. After Linda's responsive filing, Carmichael went quiet for 4 days. Meanwhile, Patricia turned to tools outside the legal system. A new notice appeared on my door, stapled again, same heavy orange paper. This time citing a violation I had never heard cited before. Section 19, Conduct Detrimental to Community Harmony. The notice described my attendance at HOA meetings, my conversations with neighbors, and my legal correspondence as coordinated disruption of HOA governance and community cohesion. The fine proposed, $750 per incident. The notice listed 3 incidents. Cynthia called me when she got her version of the same notice. "She's going after all of us," Cynthia said. "Me, you, the Vasquez couple. Same language." I read mine and noted something specific. The notice cited my conversations with neighbors as a violation. Specific neighbors were named: Tom Delaney, James Okafor, Cynthia Marsh. "She's naming people," I said to Cynthia. "She's trying to make them afraid to talk to me." Cynthia said, "Or she's surveilling them. Do you know how she knows you talked to James?" I didn't know. I thought about it that evening. The Cedar Pines community was small, 62 properties, most people at least casually acquainted. Information moved easily, but the notice was specific about dates. Tuesday, November 9th, the date James had come to my door. How did she know the date? I walked James's likely route from his house to mine. There was one point where the path was visible from Patricia's lakeside deck with a clear sight line. Patricia had a deck chair positioned at that exact corner of her porch. She was watching. I didn't say anything to anyone for 2 days. I thought about what to do with the knowledge that Patricia was surveilling her neighbors. I thought about whether I was being paranoid or rational. Then Tom called and mentioned, offhand, that his truck had a strange oil stain on the driveway, and he'd noticed it seemed to appear on days he'd walked over to visit me. It wasn't rational to think Patricia was damaging Tom's truck. But the surveillance? That I believed. Linda added the surveillance evidence, the specific dates, the sightline documentation, the named neighbors in the violation notices to our filing. Our motion for injunctive relief was now accompanied by a motion for emergency relief citing harassment and intimidation of witnesses. The court date was set for a Thursday in early December. We were 3 weeks out. Patricia did not slow down. She called an emergency board meeting, Donna and Rick only, and passed 3 resolutions in 1 hour. First, a formal assessment of $500 per property per month for enhanced community maintenance that appeared in no approved budget and had no covenant basis. Second, a new rule requiring HOA approval for any third-party guest staying more than 3 consecutive nights. Third, a resolution authorizing the HOA to contract with an outside security service to conduct property compliance monitoring in the community. I received written notice of all 3 resolutions the following morning. I forwarded them to Linda. She called me back in 20 minutes, speaking faster than usual. "She's lost it," Linda said. "A monthly assessment with no budget basis is just... She's making things up now. She's not even trying to stay within the amendment framework she invented. She's improvising. Is that good for us?" I asked. "It's great for us," Linda said. "And it might be genuinely alarming for whoever is paying for her attorney." I wondered about that, who was paying. Carmichael wasn't cheap. The HOA funds, which I'd reviewed in the partial records we'd received, showed a reserve account of about $84,000. But HOA funds couldn't properly be used for this kind of aggressive litigation. There would have to be a membership vote to authorize extraordinary legal expenditures. No such vote had been held. Someone was paying Carmichael's bills. I had a theory about who. Tom confirmed it indirectly without realizing it. He mentioned one evening that Patricia had been seen having lunch at the Bellevue restaurant where Finch Group occasionally held client meetings, twice in November. He'd seen it because his daughter worked as a server there. This was not evidence, but it was a thread. Linda added it to the growing fabric of what we were building. The security monitoring service Patricia had contracted appeared at Cedar Pines on a Monday morning. A white van with a magnetic logo that read Lake Country Property Services, parked at the community entrance. A man in a blue polo sat in the van with a clipboard and what appeared to be a camera with a long lens. He photographed vehicles entering and exiting the community. He photographed people walking between properties. I photographed the van with my phone. Several neighbors called or texted me about it. The consensus was unease, a feeling of being watched in a place that had, until recently, felt like home. By afternoon, James Okafor, who had, I was learning, a quiet talent for research, had run the company name and found that Lake Country Property Services was registered 4 months ago with a P.O. box in Renton. Its registered agent was a woman named Carmichael Hayes. The attorney's wife, possibly. Or sister. Either way. I wrote up a summary of the security van situation and sent it to Linda. She sent it to our court contact with a note that the HOA was conducting surveillance on homeowners in connection with pending litigation. The court contact suggested we file an emergency motion. Linda agreed. We filed the same afternoon. The van was gone by Tuesday morning. Whether Patricia pulled it or received notice of the motion, I didn't know. But its absence felt like a small, clarifying victory, the first thing I had visibly caused to stop happening. I walked to the dock that morning and stood in the winter cold and watched the lake and let myself feel it for exactly 5 minutes. Then I went inside and went back to work. Patricia escalated personally on a Thursday evening. I was at Tom's for dinner when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. Back off while you still can. You don't know how deep this goes. I photographed the screen and sent it to Linda and then set my phone down and finished my pot roast. Tom asked if I was okay. Yes, I said, and I was, because that text wasn't a threat from someone operating from a position of strength. That was a threat from someone who was scared. Linda had the number traced, not by law enforcement, not yet, but through a skip tracing service she sometimes used. The number was a prepaid phone, purchased at a Walgreens in Bellevue 11 days ago. She added it to the file. If this goes federal, Linda said, that prepaid phone is going to be very interesting. I asked if it was going federal. She said, it might. The HOA held what Patricia billed as an emergency community safety meeting on the second Friday of December. It was not a meeting about safety. It was, as I understood it from the agenda Patricia emailed to the community list, a presentation titled Protecting Cedar Pines from Hostile Actors, a community update. The hostile actor, though not named, was clearly me. I attended with Tom, Cynthia, James, Bev, and the Vasquez couple. Patricia opened the meeting with a slide presentation, an actual laptop and projector setup. The slides covered outstanding violations by property, the current litigation status, described as a nuisance filing by a disruptive homeowner, the HOA's legal strategy, and what she called a pattern of organized interference with community governance. One slide showed a timeline of my actions since arriving in October, when I'd attended meetings, filed appeals, requested records. The dates were accurate. She had been tracking me from the beginning. The room was quiet during the presentation in a way that was different from the quiet at the emergency meeting 2 weeks earlier. That quiet had been uncertain, building toward eruption. This quiet was considered. People were watching Patricia and they were watching me. They were calculating. I sat in the third row with my hands folded in my lap and said nothing until she opened the floor for questions. I raised my hand. Patricia hesitated just barely before calling on me. I stood up. Ms. Holloway, can you tell the community what Section 18B of the covenant says, and when it was ratified by homeowners? She said the covenants had been updated by the board. I asked when. She said over the past 14 months. I asked if the homeowners had voted. She said board authority covered the updates. I asked if she could produce the vote records. She said they were in the administrative files. Cynthia stood up from the second row. I've requested those records 3 times in writing, Cynthia said. They haven't been produced. Patricia said they would be produced in due course. A man in the back, the University of Washington sweatshirt man, I now knew his name was Paul Chun, no relation, said, due course seems to be taking a while. There was laughter. It wasn't cruel laughter. It was tired, dry, worn-out laughter. It was the laughter of 62 families who had been patient for too long. Patricia called the meeting to order. She called it twice. Donna, at the side table, was looking at her water glass with great concentration. Rick was not present. Rick, I'd been told, had stopped attending Patricia's unofficial meetings 2 weeks ago. He had not resigned from the board. He was simply becoming increasingly invisible. After the meeting in the parking lot, 6 more homeowners came to me. 2 of them, the couple named Hendricks on the West Shore, said they'd received a notice that morning threatening their property with accelerated lien proceedings unless they paid a $1,100 accumulated fine balance by end of month. They had called a real estate attorney. He'd told them to fight it. We want to join your lawsuit, said Mrs. Hendricks. She was shaking slightly, not from cold. I told her to call Linda. I gave her Linda's card. Then I drove home in the dark with the heater running full and thought about the 6 new people in the parking lot and the $1,100 and the Hendricks families shaking hands, and the fact that Patricia had, in the space of 6 weeks, gone from managed aggression to something that looked increasingly like panic dressed up as offense. I received a call from the Washington State Attorney General's office on a Monday morning in mid-December. It was a staff attorney named Brianna Osei. She was polite, professional, and asked me a series of very specific questions about the Cedar Pines HOA's governance practices and record-keeping. I answered everything and mentioned the Finch Group connection. There was a beat. We've actually received several complaints about Cedar Pines in recent weeks, she said. We're looking into the matter. I thanked her and called Linda immediately. It's moving, Linda said. It's moving faster than I expected. Patricia must have received some signal that the AG's office was asking questions, because she did something that surprised even Cynthia. She called me directly on a Tuesday evening. No attorney, no formal notice. My phone rang with a number I recognized from the HOA email header. I almost didn't answer. Then I put it on speaker and answered. Ms. Chun, she said. Patricia Holloway. Her voice was controlled, but the control was working too hard, like a door being held shut. I think we should talk. I think there's been a misunderstanding about the community's goals and my role in pursuing them. I've been focused on protecting property values, and I understand that some of my approaches may have created conflict. I'd like to find a way to resolve this. I let the silence run for 3 full seconds. Ms. Holloway, I said, are you recording this call? She said no. I said, I am. Good evening. And I ended the call. I sent the recording to Linda. Linda listened to it and said, she's been talking to a new attorney, or maybe the AG's office has contacted her directly. She knows the lien isn't going to hold if we prevail on the amendment challenge, and she's trying to find a way to pull back without it looking like a collapse. I asked what I should do. Linda said, nothing. Let it run. Our court date is in 2 weeks. Let the judge do the talking. The week before the court date, Linda received a call from Carmichael. He was no longer representing the HOA. He cited a conflict of interest he hadn't previously identified. Linda filed this development with the court and noted that the HOA was now pro se unrepresented. The judge, from what Linda said, was not happy about a pro-SEHOA walking into a complex injunctive relief hearing. He gave Patricia 7 days to retain new counsel or appear herself. Patricia appeared herself. She arrived at King County Superior Court on a Thursday morning in December in a dark blazer and heels, carrying a leather portfolio and the composed bearing of someone who believed that preparation could substitute for expertise. Judge Raymond Okafor, no relation to James, it was a coincidence I found oddly satisfying, was 61 years old, thorough, and not inclined toward patience with procedural shortcuts. Linda had prepared an organized, meticulous presentation. The original covenants, recorded in 2001. The amendment procedure requirement. Patricia's 3 unauthorized amendments. The enforcement actions taken under those amendments. The fine schedule. The lien. The cross-reference to Finch Group property acquisitions. The Garcia account. The James Okafor account. The text message. The fake HOA attorney conflict of interest. She laid it out in 2 hours. It was a clean, professional dismantling. Patricia's counter-presentation was nearly 45 minutes. She cited the board's authority, the community's right to maintain standards, the disruption caused by a small group of homeowners with personal grievances. She was articulate. She was organized. She was wrong on the law, and the judge knew it, and she could not quite stop the judge from knowing it no matter how well she explained her position. Judge Okafor asked her 3 questions. 1. Where in the original recorded covenants did board resolution authority extend to amendment of core governing provisions? She cited the section she'd amended. He noted carefully that citing an amended provision as authority for amending the provision was circular. 2. Had any homeowner vote been held on the amendment of the parking, maintenance, or fine schedule provisions? She said the board had authority. He noted she hadn't answered the question. 3. Could she identify the legal standard that permitted a 3-person board to bind 62 homeowners to substantive covenant changes without a vote? She said she would need time to research. He said she had 5 minutes. She used the 5 minutes. She produced a case citation from her portfolio. Judge Okafor looked at it for 30 seconds and then said, gently, that the case concerned condominium association rules, not recorded deed restrictions in a planned residential community, and was not applicable. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Your Honor, the HOA has been trying to maintain community standards against systematic disruption. The judge looked at her. Ms. Holloway, he said, I'm going to grant the injunction. He granted it from the bench. Injunctive relief. The lien against my property was stayed pending full litigation. All enforcement actions under the 3 unauthorized amendments were suspended immediately. The HOA was prohibited from issuing new fines under any section of the amended covenants pending determination of their validity. He scheduled a full evidentiary hearing for February and recommended that the HOA retain counsel for that proceeding. Patricia stood very still when the ruling was read. She didn't move for a moment. Not dramatically still, just the stillness of someone absorbing information that is significantly different from what they expected. Then she gathered her portfolio and walked out of the courtroom with her chin up and her shoulders straight, and she pushed through the door before I could see her face. I stood in the courthouse hallway afterward, and Linda put her hand on my shoulder and said, "Good day. Good day." I agreed. I called Tom from the parking garage. He said, "Tell me." I told him. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Well, about time." I drove home to Cedar Pines in the winter dark and felt something uncomplicate itself in my chest. But the injunction was not the end. I knew this. Linda knew this. The full case was scheduled for February. Patricia had lost the first round and the lien was stayed. But the underlying claims, the fraud, the Finch Group connection, the potential AG investigation were still in motion. Patricia still lived at Cedar Pines. She was still HOA president, technically. She still had Donna. She still had the administrative office in her guest room. And people like Patricia do not go quietly. I had learned that much. Tom came by the next morning. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and I poured coffee, and he said, "She was at the community mailbox area at 7 this morning. Just standing there. Not getting mail. Just standing." He paused. "She looked different. I've never seen her look like that." "Like what?" I asked. Tom thought about it. "Like someone who doesn't know which room to go to," he said. The Friday after the injunction, Rick, the third board member, came to my door. He came alone, without announcement, and stood on my porch in a down vest and work boots and looked like a man who had spent several days organizing what he wanted to say. "I want you to know I didn't understand all of it," he said. "The Finch thing. I didn't know about that." I asked what he did know. He said, "I knew she was aggressive. I thought that was just her style. I thought the enforcement was legitimate." He looked at his boots. "I'm going to resign from the board." "Don't yet," I said. He looked up. "Stay on the board through the February hearing," I said. "If you resign now, she and Donna have a quorum and can keep passing resolutions. If you stay and abstain or vote no, it disrupts her majority. And we may need your testimony about the amendment process." He was quiet for a moment. "You knew this would happen," he said. "The board becoming a problem." "I hoped it might," I said. He went home. He didn't resign. 2 days later, Donna resigned. She sent an email to the HOA list saying she was stepping back from volunteer commitments for personal reasons. It was thin and everyone knew what it meant. She had been at the Bellevue meeting. She had been at every board session where the unauthorized amendments were passed. She was getting out before the February hearing. Patricia was now, functionally, a board of one, with Rick technically present but visibly neutral. Patricia filed a countermotion the week after Donna's resignation. It was a pro-SE motion contesting the scope of the injunction and requesting that the court limit Linda's documentary evidence in the February hearing to items directly relevant to the fine disputes, excluding any materials related to third-party business relationships or alleged misconduct outside the HOA's jurisdiction. It was a motion to keep Finch Group out of the courtroom. Judge Okafor denied it in 4 sentences. The AG's office called Linda on a Thursday. Brianna Osei said they had completed their preliminary review of the Cedar Pines HOA's governance practices and had identified significant concerns warranting a formal inquiry. They were issuing a civil investigative demand to the HOA for records. Separately, she mentioned carefully that the Finch Group connection was an area of interest that they were examining. Linda thanked her and called me. "It's going federal adjacent," she said. "State AG with federal implications. They're going to be looking at wire fraud." Gerald Finch issued a public statement on a Monday, a short one, on the Finch Group website that I found because James texted me a screenshot. The statement said Finch Group had occasionally explored acquisition opportunities in Pacific Northwest Lake communities, but had no involvement in Cedar Pines HOA governance or operations. It was the statement of a company trying to create distance without creating an admission. Linda read it and said, "He's lawyered up." Patricia stopped submitting new citations. I noticed this about 2 weeks after the injunction. The mailbox was empty. The door was untapped. No new notices. No new orange paper. She was still present in the community. I saw her car, saw her walking to the mailboxes occasionally, but the constant administrative pressure had stopped. The quiet felt unfamiliar at first. Then it felt like what it was, the sound of a strategy losing momentum. I spoke to Brianna Osei directly once, at Linda's suggestion, to provide a narrative account of my experience from October through December. I spoke for about 90 minutes. She took notes. At the end she asked, "Is there anything else you'd like the Attorney General's office to know?" I thought about it. "The Garcia family," I said. "Sofia and Marco Garcia. They were my tenants. They were targeted because of the Talavera son. But that wasn't really it. Patricia told them they didn't fit. She told them, to their face, that they should resolve their residency situation voluntarily." Brianna wrote it down. She said, "I'll be in touch." The week before Christmas, the Cedar Pines HOA Facebook group had an unexpected development. Someone, username Cedar Pines Homeowner 2001, clearly an older account, posted the full text of the original recorded covenants, the 3 unauthorized amendments, and a side-by-side comparison showing exactly what Patricia had changed and what the original ratification requirement was. The post got 47 reactions, 12 comments, 3 shares. Patricia's counter-comment, "This post contains incomplete and misleading information," got 1 reaction. It was a thumbs down. Christmas was quiet. I decorated the cabin for the first time. Strung lights on the dock railing, put a wreath on the door, set candles in the window. Tom and Helen invited me for Christmas dinner. James brought his kids. Cynthia brought wine and her binder. We talked about the February hearing and also about things that had nothing to do with the February hearing. Tom's vegetable garden planning for spring, James's daughter's college applications, Cynthia's crossword puzzle habit. Felt more than anything like a neighborhood. Patricia did not celebrate visibly. Her house had the same exterior lights as every other year, Tom said. No extra decorations. No holiday gathering. Her car sat in the driveway and occasionally moved and came back. She was managing something internal that she was keeping internal. I thought about her sometimes, not with satisfaction, not yet, but with the specific attention you give to an equation that isn't resolved. She had not finished being dangerous. I was certain of that. January was cold. The lake iced over at the North Shore, which Tom said hadn't happened in 4 years. I worked on a freelance engineering project, walked the property daily, kept the dock clear of ice. I had a rhythm now, the rhythm of someone who belongs where they are. Linda filed pre-hearing briefs. The AG's inquiry moved forward, outside my direct view. Carmichael had apparently been replaced. The HOA had found a third attorney, a woman named Sheila Kwan, who called Linda in January to discuss the February hearing and was, Linda reported, notably more realistic about the HOA's position than her predecessors. Patricia called an HOA meeting in January. The attendance was 23 people. I was there. The meeting lasted 35 minutes. She covered the upcoming hearing, which she described as an opportunity to clarify the HOA's legal standing, the budget for Q1, a proposal for spring landscaping in the common areas. Rick abstained on the landscaping vote. Donna wasn't there. The meeting ended without drama. Patricia collected her materials and left without speaking to anyone. Tom walked out with me. "Did you see her face when she looked at the sign-in sheet?" he asked. 23 names, out of 62 properties. She had called a meeting and less than 40% of the community had shown up. 3 months ago it had been 51. "She's losing them," Tom said. I nodded. "She lost them a while ago," I said. "She's just catching up to it." The February hearing date approached. Sheila Kwan reached out to Linda with a settlement proposal. The HOA would void the fines issued under the 3 unauthorized amendments, reverse the lien, and remove the habitual violation property designations. In exchange, we would drop the lawsuit. Linda brought it to me. I read it. "No," I said. "What about the people who already paid? The 22 families who paid fines without appeal? What about them?" Linda said, "That's what I thought too." She told Sheila Kwan we needed refunds for all homeowners who'd paid fines under void amendments, and a full accounting. Kwan said she'd take it back to the client. The answer was no. Patricia would not agree to refunds. She would void going forward, but she would not acknowledge the past. Linda said, "Then we go to the hearing and we win everything." I said, "Yes." And 2 days later I got the call from Brianna Osei at the AG's office that changed the shape of what was coming. She said, "Ms. Chun, I wanted to give you advance notice. The Attorney General's office is filing a civil action against the Cedar Pines HOA and Patricia Holloway individually. The action will be filed concurrent with your February hearing. You should coordinate with your attorney." I thanked her and sat for a long moment, and then I called Linda, and Linda was very quiet, and then she said something she had never said to me before. "Mara, she's done." The night before the February hearing, I sat on my dock under a clear January sky. The hearing had been moved up a week, and looked at the lake. The ice had retreated from the north shore. The water was black and still, and the stars were very clear above it. I thought about October, arriving here with my car and my luggage and my coffee and my complete ignorance of what was waiting for me. I thought about the Talavera sun. I thought about the Garcias. I thought about Tom and Cynthia and James and all the people who'd paid fines they shouldn't have paid and said nothing and felt ashamed of something that wasn't their fault. I went inside and I slept well. In the morning I put on a dark blazer, not unlike Patricia's, which I noticed only as I looked in the mirror, and drove to King County Superior Court. Linda met me in the lobby. She had 2 paralegals and a banker's box of documents. We rode the elevator to the 4th floor in silence. The doors opened. We walked down the hall toward courtroom 14. Halfway there, coming from the opposite direction, I saw Patricia Holloway walking toward the same courtroom. She saw me at the same moment. We walked toward each other for 5 full steps before we both looked away. She looked tired. Not the tiredness of a bad night, the tiredness of months. The exhaustion of someone who has spent a long time maintaining a position that requires more energy to sustain as it becomes less tenable. Her posture was still good. The blazer was pressed. But something behind her eyes had changed from the certainty I'd seen on my porch in October. I held the door for her. She walked through without comment. We took our seats on opposite sides of the courtroom, and the bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Okafor looked out over the room, and I folded my hands on the table in front of me, and I waited. Judge Okafor entered at exactly 9:02 a.m. The courtroom was nearly full. I hadn't expected that. Tom was there, in a button-down and slacks, with Helen beside him. James sat 1 row behind, next to Cynthia with her binder. The Vasquez couple. The Hendricks family. Paul Chen in a cleaner version of his UW sweatshirt. Bev Kowalski. Karen Osgood from the Facebook group. And others I recognized from the parking lot after the November meeting, people whose names I was still learning. They had come. Patricia had no one with her except Sheila Kwan, who sat at the defense table with the posture of a professional preparing to do a difficult but defined job. Donna wasn't there. Rick wasn't there. The board of the Cedar Pines HOA in its current form was present in that room in 2 people only, Patricia Holloway and her newest attorney. I noticed Patricia's eyes move to the gallery once, scanning, counting, and then move away. Judge Okafor opened by noting the concurrent filing of the Attorney General's civil action, which he said would run parallel to the present proceedings. He described it as a related but distinct matter, and said the AG's findings might be incorporated into the evidentiary record by stipulation. Sheila Kwan objected to this characterization. Linda did not object. The judge sustained Linda's non-objection and moved on. Linda's opening statement took 22 minutes. She was methodical and clear in the way that the best attorneys are, no rhetorical flourish, no emotional appeals, just the architecture of the facts laid out in order. The original covenants, the required ratification procedure, the 3 unauthorized amendments, the enforcement actions, the fines, the lien, the Finch Group connection. She ended by saying, "What the evidence will show is not a homeowners association in good faith enforcement of community standards. It is a coordinated scheme to depress property values for private financial benefit, using the tools of an HOA as the instrument." The room was very quiet after that. Sheila Kwan's opening was 10 minutes. She argued that the HOA board had acted in good faith under its reasonable interpretation of its authority, that the enforcement actions were based on genuine violations, and that any connection to third-party real estate interests was speculative and circumstantial. She was professional. She was doing the best she could with what she had. I watched Patricia during Kwan's statement. Patricia was looking at the table, not at the judge, not at the room, at the table. Linda called her first witness, Cynthia Marsh. Cynthia walked to the stand with her binder and was sworn in and settled into the witness chair with the calm of a retired paralegal who has spent decades in courtrooms and found them mostly comprehensible. She described the unauthorized amendments. She walked the court through the original covenant's amendment procedure, side by side with what the board had done. She was precise. She was unshakable. Kwan's cross-examination lasted 11 minutes and established nothing useful to the defense. The second witness was Dale Hutchins. He described the pattern of violation notices during the Garcia tenancy, his communications with Patricia's HOA during that period, and the letter Patricia had sent to his office attorney suggesting the property was improperly registered as a short-term rental. Linda asked him, "Was that characterization accurate?" Dale said, "No. It was a long-term rental and had been properly disclosed to the HOA at the time of registration." Linda sat down. Kwan asked Dale if he'd ever been told by Patricia directly that she wanted the property to go up for sale. He said no. Linda had not expected him to say yes. The third witness was Marco Garcia. He'd driven up from Puyallup with Sophia. He sat in the witness chair in a neat gray suit and testified, in careful English, about the evening Patricia had come to their door. He described her words, that there had been community concerns about their occupancy, that it would be better for everyone if they resolved their residency situation voluntarily. Linda asked, "Did she say you had violated any specific covenant?" He said, "No." Linda asked, "Did she say what the community concerns were?" He said, "She said we were not a good fit for the community." Linda said, "Thank you." Kwan chose not to cross-examine Marco Garcia. The fourth witness was Rick Morrison, the third board member. He'd reached out to Linda's office voluntarily the previous week, and I'd been careful not to speak to him again after telling him not to resign. He was sworn in and described attending the board sessions at which the 3 amendments were passed. He said he had not understood at the time that a homeowner vote was required. He said Patricia had told the board that the amendment procedure had been reviewed and cleared by HOA legal counsel. Linda asked, "Was HOA legal counsel present at those meetings?" Rick said, "No." She asked, "Did you see any written legal opinion authorizing the amendment procedure?" He said, "No." Kwan cross-examined Rick for 25 minutes. She established that Rick had voted in favor of the amendments, suggesting he'd ratified them knowingly. Rick said he'd followed Patricia's guidance. She pushed back. Wasn't he an independent board member with a duty to exercise his own judgment? He said yes. She asked if he understood the covenant ratification requirements before the meetings. He said he had not independently reviewed them. The exchange was damaging to Rick personally, but didn't substantively help Patricia. If anything, it highlighted that the board had been operating under Patricia's unilateral direction. Linda called a fifth witness I had not expected. Amy Sato from the King County Recorder's Office, the clerk who'd helped me in October. She testified to the recorded covenants and confirmed that no formal amendment to the core governing documents had been recorded with the county in the history of the Cedar Pines community. For an amendment to the recorded deed restrictions to be binding on all homeowners, it would need to be recorded. Nothing had been recorded. The amendments Patricia had issued existed only in her versions of the document. They were nowhere in the official public record. Patricia's face when Amy Sato finished her testimony was the face of someone who has built a structure and just learned the foundation was always hollow. She wrote something on a notepad and slid it to Kwan. Kwan read it and wrote something back. Patricia read Kwan's response and was still. Linda then moved to the documentary evidence. The property transfer records, the LLC registrations, the shared registered agent address. She introduced them methodically, with expert testimony from a title researcher she had retained. The researcher walked the court through the 6 properties sold under lien pressure, the LLC buyers, and the Finch Group connection. Patricia objected, through Kwan, that the Finch evidence was speculative and prejudicial. Judge Okafor overruled the objection and noted that the probative value was significant. Gerald Finch was not in the courtroom. His name appeared repeatedly in the documentary record, in the testimony, in Linda's narrative. He was present as an absence. I wondered where he was. His company's website had been updated the previous week. I'd noticed the Pacific Northwest Lake Communities portfolio section had been removed entirely. At the lunch break, I walked to the courthouse lobby with Linda and Tom, who'd been allowed to leave the gallery. Tom bought coffee from a cart. We stood by the windows looking out at the gray February sky. "How's it going?" Tom asked Linda. "Very well," Linda said, which was the attorney equivalent of "we're winning decisively." Tom looked at me. "How are you?" I said, "I'm ready for the afternoon session." The afternoon session began with Linda calling James Okafor. He described what he'd overheard at the boathouse, Patricia referencing the lien strategy and Finch by name. Kwan challenged the admissibility of the testimony as hearsay about a third party who was not on trial. Judge Okafor said the statement was admissible as a statement against interest by a party to the action. He admitted it. Kwan noted her objection for the record. Linda then called one more witness, and this one I had not known about until the morning of the hearing. Linda had kept it from me deliberately, she said later, because she didn't want my anticipation to show in the courtroom. The witness was a woman named Diane Crowley. She was 60 years old and had sold her Cedar Pines property 19 months ago, one of the 6 properties I'd identified in the county records. She had sold to one of the LLCs. Diane Crowley testified that she had sold her property under duress following a lien placed on the property for $3,400 in accumulated HOA fines. She'd been at Cedar Pines for 11 years. The fines had begun. She described this carefully, checking dates in a notebook, within 2 months of Patricia Holloway becoming HOA president. She'd consulted an attorney but couldn't afford protracted litigation. She'd accepted an offer from an LLC she didn't know. The offer was $87,000 below the appraised value of the property. She'd accepted it because the alternative was foreclosure proceedings. She'd moved to Spokane to live with her daughter. She had not been back to Lake Harrow. When Diane Crowley finished testifying, the courtroom was very quiet. Not the charged quiet of conflict, the quiet of something being absorbed. I heard Tom cough once, softly. I heard nothing else. Kwan's cross of Diane Crowley lasted 4 minutes. There was nothing useful to be established. Kwan said, "Nothing further." She sat down. Linda rested the plaintiff's case at 3:47 p.m. Sheila Kwan asked for a 30-minute recess. Judge Okafor gave her 15. During the recess, I sat at the plaintiff's table and Linda reviewed her notes and said nothing. Patricia sat at the defense table 20 feet away and wrote steadily on a legal pad. I didn't look at her directly. I could see her in my peripheral vision, the controlled posture, the pen moving, the jaw set. She was preparing her testimony. She was going to testify on her own behalf. She did. Sheila Kwan called Patricia Holloway to the stand. Patricia walked to the witness box with her portfolio in hand and was sworn in and settled herself with the deliberate poise of a woman who has spent her adult life performing composure under pressure. She was good. She answered Kwan's direct examination questions with precision and detail. She described her vision for Cedar Pines as a community, her genuine belief that enforcement of standards protected property values for all homeowners. She denied knowledge of any connection between HOA enforcement activity and Finch Group property acquisitions. She described her legal advice regarding the amendments as verbal consultation with an HOA attorney whose engagement she had. She admitted, not formally retained. That last point, the verbal consultation, that had apparently not involved a retainer or a written opinion, was where Kwan had to work hardest to minimize the damage. She asked Patricia to confirm that she had genuinely believed the board had authority to make the amendments. Patricia said yes, she had believed it. Based on your understanding of the covenants and your legal consultation? Yes, Patricia said. Her voice was steady. I made a note. Linda stood up for cross-examination. She was quiet for a moment before beginning, the pause of someone choosing exactly where to put the first incision. Then, Ms. Holloway, you testified that you received verbal legal advice that the board had authority to amend the covenants without homeowner ratification. Can you provide the name of the attorney who gave you that advice? Patricia said, I consulted informally with Warren Stiles. Warren Stiles, Linda repeated. The attorney who withdrew from representing the HOA in October of last year, citing irreconcilable differences in strategic approach? Yes, Patricia said. Mr. Stiles withdrew in connection with the current litigation. Did he tell you why? Kwan objected. Attorney-client privilege. Linda withdrew the question. Ms. Holloway, Linda continued, you testified that the enforcement actions against Cedar Pines properties were based on genuine violations of community standards. Is that correct? Yes. Did any of those enforcement actions result in the owners of those properties selling their homes? Some homeowners made the personal decision to sell, yes. After receiving lien notices from the HOA, that was their individual decision. Did you contact any of those homeowners prior to or during the lien process to suggest they sell? I may have discussed the options available to them. What options did you discuss? Patricia paused. That they could pay the outstanding balance, pursue the appeals process, or, if they found the situation untenable, consider other options. Did other options include selling? I may have mentioned it as one possibility. Ms. Holloway, you told Marco Garcia that his family should resolve their residency situation. Were those your words? I don't recall the exact phrasing. Mr. Garcia does. It's in his testimony. I may have had a conversation with Mr. Garcia about community fit. Community fit, Linda said. What does that phrase mean to you in the context of Cedar Pines? It refers to, can you think of any objective community standard? Linda interrupted, measured. That is captured by the phrase community fit? Kwan objected. Judge Okafor sustained it, but the phrase was in the room. Let me ask it differently, Linda said. The Talavera sun decoration, the one for which you cited the Garcia family under the exterior ornamentation section. You've testified that the citation was based on Section 11D of the amended covenants, correct? Yes. Was that section in the original 2001 recorded covenants? Patricia said, the covenants had been updated. Was that specific section in the original 2001 recorded covenants? Linda asked again distinctly. Patricia said, the board's authority to update. Ms. Holloway, Linda said quietly, was Section 11D in the original 2001 document? Yes or no? The courtroom waited. No, Patricia said. Her voice was steady, but just barely. No, Linda repeated softly. So you cited a family for displaying a ceramic sun on their own front door under a rule that did not exist in the recorded covenants. And then you told them they didn't fit. She paused. Thank you, Ms. Holloway. She sat down. Patricia looked at Judge Okafor. He was writing. He did not look up. Quan had no redirect questions. Patricia returned to the defense table. The room had a quality I'd felt in a few courtrooms over my life. Not drama exactly, but the particular hush that follows something that cannot be untold. Patricia sat down, folded her hands on the table, and looked at the wall. Her face was composed. Absolutely composed. Whatever she was feeling was being held inside something very tight. Quan's closing was 15 minutes. She argued good faith, board authority, procedural regularity. She noted that the Finch Group connection remained circumstantial. She acknowledged that the amendment procedure had not been ideal. She was doing the best that could be done. It was insufficient, and she knew it. Linda's closing was 28 minutes. She ended by describing Diane Crowley, 11 years in Cedar Pines, driven to sell at a loss, living with her daughter in Spokane. She said, "This is what unchecked HOA authority looks like when it is weaponized. This is the cost of one person's conviction that the rules exist to serve her vision rather than to serve this community." The plaintiff asks this court to restore what was taken, from Ms. Chun, from the Garcia family, from the Hendricks family, from Diane Crowley, from every homeowner in Cedar Pines who paid a fine under a rule that was never legitimately enacted. She sat down. Judge Okafor said he would issue a written ruling but indicated from the bench his preliminary conclusions. The 3 covenant amendments were void. All enforcement actions taken under them were void. The lien against my property was void. He ordered the HOA to produce full financial records for the preceding 30 months to the court. He noted the AG's concurrent investigation. He said, and I wrote this down exactly, "The evidence suggests a pattern of conduct that exceeds aggressive enforcement and approaches coordinated misconduct. I will be referring the financial records to the AG's office directly." Patricia was very still when Judge Okafor said that last sentence. She was so still that I instinctively looked at her more carefully, the way you look at something when movement stops unexpectedly. Her pen was in her hand. She wasn't writing. She was holding the pen without using it. Quan put her hand briefly on Patricia's arm. Patricia did not react to it. The judge dismissed the session. The bailiff called the room to order for his exit. People began gathering their things. I stood and turned to Linda, and she extended her hand, and we shook hands, and I said, "Thank you." And she said, "You did the work." In the gallery, Tom was standing, and he looked like he'd been holding something in for a long time and had just been given permission to set it down. I walked out of the courtroom into the hall. People came up, Tom and Helen, James, Cynthia still carrying her binder, the Hendricks family, Paul Chun, Bev Kowalski, people I'd stood with in parking lots and sat beside at meetings and eaten dinner with and built something with over 4 months. There were handshakes and 1 or 2 hugs and a lot of the particular warmth of people who have been through something together and have come out of it still standing. Patricia came out of the courtroom 30 seconds after us, with Quan beside her. She walked directly to the elevator bank without looking at the gallery cluster. The elevator opened immediately as if it had been waiting. She stepped in. Quan followed. The doors closed. The group fell briefly quiet, and then conversation resumed, and nobody said anything about it directly, and that quiet felt like the right response too. Outside the courthouse, in the February cold, Tom stood beside me on the steps for a moment before we walked to our cars. He looked at the gray sky and the street below. "For months," he said. I said, "For months." He said, "I've been at Cedar Pines for 19 years, and I've never felt like the community actually worked until you moved in and started a lawsuit." I laughed. He didn't quite, but he almost did. I drove home alone. I took the long way through the downtown, past the waterfront, onto the highway that wraps the east side of the lake. The water was visible through the trees, gray-green in the February light. I drove slowly. I wasn't in a hurry for the first time in months. The ruling came in writing 8 days later. 23 pages. Judge Okafor voided the 3 amendments in full. He voided all fines issued under those amendments, 61 fines across 29 households. He voided the lien against my property. He ordered the HOA to refund all fines paid under the void amendments, totaling $14,720. He referred the full financial record to the AG's office. He noted, in the final paragraph, that the evidence of systematic enforcement pressure to drive property sales warrants examination by appropriate law enforcement authorities. Law enforcement authorities. Linda called me after I'd read it and said, "She's going to be investigated, possibly criminally. The AG civil case and the financial referral, those are going to pull Finch in too." I asked what that meant practically. Linda said, "It means this isn't over, but the part that was your fight is over. What comes next is their consequence. You don't have to carry it." I sat with that distinction for the rest of the day. My fight was over. Their consequence was coming. Those were 2 different things, and I was allowed to put down the first one even though the second was still in motion. 3 days after the written ruling, Patricia's house went quiet in a new way. Not the quiet of someone lying low, the quiet of absence. Tom noticed it first. Her car hadn't moved in 36 hours. The lights were on timers. He walked past the following morning and there was a note on her door from a package delivery service. Delivery attempted. No answer. A week later I learned from Tom, who'd heard from Karen Osgood, who'd heard through a chain I couldn't quite follow, that Patricia Holloway had listed her property with a real estate agent, not an LLC buyer, not a distressed sale, a standard listing at market rate. She was selling. I felt something when Tom told me, not satisfaction exactly, something quieter, the absence of something that had been constantly present, the low-frequency hum of being in conflict with someone who is actively trying to harm you. It had stopped. And in its place was just the lake and the trees and the community and the morning. The HOA held a special homeowner meeting the 2nd week of March. Not called by Patricia, called by Rick Morrison, who had stayed on the board as I'd asked and had now, with Donna gone and Patricia absent, become the de facto chair by default. He was not a natural leader, Rick, but he was honest in the way that people sometimes become honest when dishonesty has shown them its full cost. The meeting was about governance reform. 44 people came. The main agenda item, electing an interim board and commissioning a review of all HOA governing documents. Tom Delaney was nominated for the interim board. He accepted with the look of a man who hadn't planned to do this but recognized it was the right thing. Cynthia Marsh was nominated. She accepted before anyone finished saying her name. A woman named Priya Anand, a corporate attorney who lived on the West Shore and had mostly stayed out of the conflict, agreed to serve as legal advisor. The amendment question was formally resolved at that meeting too. The interim board commissioned a vote of all 62 homeowners on the governance documents to be conducted by mail ballot over 30 days, as the original covenants required. The ballot would present the original 2001 document with reasonable proposed amendments, fair ones, reviewed by Priya for homeowner ratification. It was what should have happened from the beginning. I voted yes on all the reasonable amendments. The results came back at the end of March. 58 of 62 homeowners voted. 53 voted yes on the governance package. The community had spoken clearly, and for the first time in the Cedar Pines HOA's history, everyone knew exactly what the rules were and how they'd been made. The Attorney General's civil complaint against Patricia Holloway and the Cedar Pines HOA was formally filed in April. Linda sent me the press release. It was brief and factual. The AG alleged that Patricia had used the HOA as an instrument to systematically depress property values and facilitate below-market sales, in coordinated activity with Finch Group entities, constituting unfair business practices and potentially civil rights violations under Washington state law. The phrase potential civil rights violations had been added since Brianna Osei's last call. I thought about the Talavera son. Gerald Finch issued a longer statement than before. His attorney was now visible in the communications. The statement was clearly lawyer-drafted, dense with qualifications, insisting that Finch Group had engaged in routine property acquisition activity and categorically denied any coordination with the Cedar Pines HOA 3 days after the statement. A Seattle Times reporter called Linda. Linda referred her to me. I spoke to the reporter for 35 minutes. The story ran on a Sunday. The Seattle Times story was measured and factual. Finch Group's LLC acquisitions, the lien pattern, Patricia's HOA presidency, the court ruling, the AG complaint. It mentioned the Talavera son in the third paragraph. It mentioned Diane Crowley. It mentioned James Okafor's overheard conversation. It was the kind of story that people read and share and that sits in search results for a long time afterward. Finch Group's website went down 2 days after the story ran. When it came back up, the Lake Community Portfolio section remained gone, and a new About page described them as a commercial real estate consultancy with no residential community focus. The internet, predictably, had screenshots of the original site. People shared them. The reporter who'd written the Times story posted one on her professional social media account with a single sentence. Interesting refresh. Gerald Finch was named in a second filing, a federal civil complaint brought by a coalition of homeowners from 2 other Pacific Northwest lake communities, where Finch Group LLCs had acquired properties following HOA enforcement campaigns. The pattern matched Cedar Pines closely. I read about it in the Times follow-up story. Linda called me when it dropped. That's the wire fraud implication, she said. Federal jurisdiction now. This is much larger than Cedar Pines. I thought about that and about what Cynthia had said in her kitchen. Most people pay $250 and move on. Not everyone. Not anymore. Patricia's Cedar Pines property sold in April. The listing price had been $695,000. It sold for $672,000 after 23 days on market. A small discount, not a distressed one. She had not been forced out at a loss. That was the part one turned over in my mind for a while. She had left on her own terms at a price she'd chosen. But she had left, and the circumstances of her leaving were part of a public record that would follow the property, and her for a long time. I never saw Patricia again in person after the courthouse elevator. She did not come back to Cedar Pines after listing the property. Her things were packed and moved while she was absent. Tom watched the moving truck come and go on a Thursday. He texted me a single word, "Done." I was at my desk working when the text came in. I read it and set down my phone and looked out the window at the lake for a long moment. Then I went back to work. The HOA's refund process took 6 weeks. Linda supervised it. 22 families received refund checks ranging from $175 to $1,100. The Garcias received $175, the Talavera son fine, sent to their Puyallup address. Sophia texted me when it arrived. She said, "We bought a new sun, bigger this time." She sent a photo. It was a large ceramic sun, painted in deep orange and gold, hanging beside the door of their new house. I saved the photo. The AG's civil case against Patricia moved through the spring and into summer. I was a witness, a deponent more precisely, in a process that took 4 hours and covered much of the same ground as the hearing but with additional focus on the Finch coordination. I answered every question accurately and completely. Linda was there. I said what I knew and did not speculate beyond it. Patricia's deposition, Linda reported to me afterward, had lasted 7 hours. She had taken the fifth on 22 questions, her right, but not the posture of someone confident in their position. The AG's office, Brianna Osei told me in a brief follow-up call, was building the case carefully. These things take time, she said, but we're building it. I told her I wasn't going anywhere. Donna, the former board secretary, had cooperated with the AG's investigation from the beginning, apparently. Her attorney had reached out to Brianna's office in February. She had provided meeting notes she'd kept personally, distinct from the official minutes Patricia had edited. Those notes documented 2 explicit conversations in which Patricia had referenced Finch Group acquisitions and the lien strategy. She had kept them, Brianna said, because she had increasingly been uncomfortable. She had been uncomfortable for months. She had simply not known what to do about it until the investigation gave her a door to walk through. I thought about Donna, the tight, apologetic smile at the property inspection, the eyes fixed on the water glass at the December meeting. She had known more than she'd let on and less than Patricia, and she had lived in the space between those 2 things until the weight of it became unbearable. I didn't feel warmly toward her. She had ratified things she shouldn't have, but I understood the arithmetic of how people end up in positions they can't quite exit. Sometimes you need someone to open a door. In May, Gerald Finch reached a civil settlement with the Washington AG's office that was not disclosed in its financial terms, but required Finch Group to divest its Cedar Pines LLC holdings, pay restitution to former property sellers whose sales were identified as connected to the enforcement pattern, and submit to ongoing compliance monitoring. The press release used the phrase "admitted no wrongdoing," in the way that phrase is used when the alternative is a trial and both parties prefer to avoid one. 2 of the 6 Cedar Pines properties that Finch Group LLCs had purchased were put back on the market as part of the divestiture. One was bought by a young family from Tacoma, the Nguyen family, 2 kids, a kayak in the truck. Tom knocked on their door with banana bread the day they moved in. He texted me, "Did my best impression of you," giving them the lay of the land. I asked if he'd warned them about anything. He said, "Told them the HOA is run by good people now and the lake is beautiful in summer." Which is true. Patricia Holloway's civil case with the AG's office remained pending through the summer. No criminal charges had been filed as of that point. The pattern documented was civil fraud rather than clearly criminal conduct under the specific statutes involved, though Linda said that assessment could change as the federal matter involving the other communities proceeded. What had happened to Patricia was this. She had been publicly named in a state AG action. Her methods had been documented in a published court ruling that voided 14 months of work. Her name appeared in a Seattle Times story that lived permanently in the archive. Her community had reviewed her governance and found it void. What had not happened to Patricia was this. She had not been arrested. She had not lost everything. She had sold her house at a reasonable price and moved somewhere I didn't know. She was still, as far as I was aware, functional and free. This was the part of real life that doesn't feel like the end of a story, the absence of the cinematic collapse, the clean accounting. Justice in real life tends to be partial and procedural and take longer than you'd like. I had learned this. I was living with it. I went back and forth on how I felt about it. There were days when partial felt like enough, when I looked at the refund checks, at the governance reform, at the Nguyen family's kayak, at Sofia Garcia's ceramic sun, and thought, something was fixed here. Something that was broken is less broken now. And there were days when I thought about Diane Crowley in Spokane and the $87,000 she didn't get and thought, that's not fixed. That's just documented. Linda called me in June. Patricia's settled with the AG, she said. I asked the terms. Agreed to a consent decree. She's barred from serving as an officer or director of any HOA or nonprofit in Washington state for 10 years. She's paying $28,000 in penalties. And she's providing full cooperation with the federal investigation of Finch Group in exchange for limiting her personal liability in that matter. I sat with that. Barred for 10 years, I said. Yes, Linda said. From running anything like this again. Good, I said, and I meant it. I thought about the consent decree occasionally in the weeks after. What it meant in practice. Patricia Holloway could not do this again. Not here, not in another community, not through another HOA board. Not for 10 years. The instrument she'd used, the HOA president's gavel, the clipboard, the enforcement registry, the orange stapled notices, had been taken from her. That mattered. It wasn't everything, but it mattered. The Cedar Pines HOA under the interim board hired a professional management company to handle day-to-day administration. Fines still existed, you need some standards, but the fine schedule was modest and the appeals process was genuine and documented with a neutral third-party review option. Tom chaired the first regular meeting under the new structure in April. He told me afterward that it lasted 40 minutes and ended with someone suggesting they organize a community cleanup of the lake shoreline. Everyone had agreed immediately. They'd done the cleanup on a Saturday in May. 31 people showed up with trash bags. I helped with the cleanup. The weather was clear and cold in the way that Pacific Northwest springs often are, and the lake was very blue, and we worked along the shoreline for 2 hours and filled 14 bags and nobody cited anyone for anything. Afterward, Tom grilled burgers at his place and we ate standing up in his backyard. James brought his kids. The Nguyen family came. Cynthia brought her crossword but didn't open it. It was, in every way, an ordinary afternoon among neighbors. It was the most ordinary afternoon I'd had in 6 months. I sat in Tom's lawn chair with a burger and a can of sparkling water and watched the lake and thought, this is what it was supposed to be. Not the fights, not the courthouse, not the 4 months of documented attrition. The afternoon light on the water and the sound of kids running and Tom arguing with James about whether the Mariners were going to make the playoffs and Cynthia doing her crossword after all. This was the point. Summer came to Cedar Pines like an exhale. The lake was warm enough to swim by July, and I swam most mornings before 7, out past the dock and back, with the mountains reflecting on the water when the sky was clear. I had extended my engineering consulting contract by 6 months. I was in no hurry to decide what came next. The Vasquez couple won their fence appeal, now reviewed by a neutral board with actual authority, and built the fence they'd wanted. They planted climbing roses along it. By August, it was beginning to fill in. The Hendricks family got their dock repainted without incident. Bev Kowalski hung a new garden hose reel whatever color she wanted. Nobody noticed or commented. That was, in itself, a kind of freedom. Linda sent me a final billing statement in August. The total cost of the litigation from October through the February ruling had been substantial. It was offset significantly by the HOA's court-ordered contribution to legal fees, which the judge had awarded under the nonprofit governance violation statutes. I paid the balance and called Linda to thank her. She said, "You ran a good case. You kept your head." "You kept my head," I said. "We kept each other's," she said, which was generous and probably accurate. Marco and Sofia Garcia came back to Lake Harrow in August. Not to stay, they'd built their life in Puyallup now, but for a day visit. Sofia wanted to see the lake. We sat on my dock in the afternoon sun, and she looked at the water and said, "This is beautiful." I said, "Yes." We didn't talk about Patricia or the HOA or the Talavera sun for the first hour. We talked about her job and her kids and a trip she was planning. Then at some point she said, looking at the water, "I used to feel guilty, like we'd done something wrong here. I don't anymore." I said, "You didn't. You never did." She nodded once and watched the mergansers cross the cove. Cynthia Marsh sold her property in September. Not under duress. She'd been planning to downsize for 2 years and had simply stayed to see the matter through. She moved to Portland to be closer to her grandchildren. She gave her binder to Tom before she left. "For the archive," she said. Tom said he'd put it in the HOA records room. Cynthia said, "Good. Let them remember." He promised they would. I stayed. Fall came and the leaves turned on the hillsides and the lake went silver again, and I bought better outdoor furniture and put it on the dock and sat there in the evenings with a blanket and a book and watched the mountains go pink in the sunset. I was not planning to leave. This was home, not a landing pad, not a rental property, not an investment. Home. It had taken a lawsuit to establish that, but there it was. There's a thing that happens when you fight for something, really fight for it, through the months and the paperwork and the courtrooms and the uncertainty, where winning doesn't feel the way you imagined it would feel when you were in the middle of the fight. It's quieter, more ordinary. One morning you realize you haven't thought about the HOA since Tuesday, and it's already Saturday. And you think, oh, so this is what it feels like when it's done. I think about Patricia sometimes. Not obsessively, just occasionally, the way you think about any long and difficult experience once it's over. I don't know where she is. I don't know if she's built another clipboard and khaki operation in another community somewhere. I know she's barred from it here for 10 years. I know Diane Crowley is in Spokane. I know the Garcias' new sun hangs in Puyallup in orange and gold. I know what the lake looks like at 7 in the morning when the fog is still on the water and the herons are working the shallows and nobody has taped an orange notice to my door. I know what that silence sounds like. It sounds like enough. One October morning, almost exactly a year from when I'd arrived, I carried my coffee to the dock and watched the merganser pair cut across the cove. Same as that first morning. Same as they'd apparently been doing since long before any of this started. The lake was calm. The mountains were white at the tops. Behind me, the cabin was mine, documented and defended and fully, finally, mine. I sat for a long time without going anywhere. And then I went inside and made breakfast and started my day.